the pursuit of freedom, boldly telling the truth in a time of universal deceit.
My guest is Larry Pratt, who's been the executive director of Gun Owners of America for over 30 years. Gun Owners of America is a national organization with over 300,000 members dedicated to promoting their Second Amendment freedom to keep and bear arms. Mr. Pratt, it's an honor to have you as a guest on Pursuit of Freedom. Could you tell our audience a bit about the mission of your organization, Gun Owners of America?
Well, for over 30 years, Gun Owners of America has lobbied the Congress seeking to get rid of firearms laws, which do not fall under the shall not be infringed standard that the Constitution provides for itself. I guess we're part of a larger problem where the government thinks that it has a perfect right to interfere in all kinds of areas where it has no authority.
We are certainly seeing government do that with a vengeance. Congressman Ron Paul said Gun Owners of America is the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. What additional characteristics differentiates Gun Owners of America from other gun rights organizations?
Well, I guess one of the clearest would be something that occurred back in the last couple of years of the Bush administration. There was something that we had dubbed the Veterans Disarmament Act, and it was designed to put people that had, and it was subsequently enlarged, by the way, in Obamacare, which led to our strenuous opposition. It provided for anybody with any kind of a psychological diagnosis that might be deemed to be make them a danger to self or others, somebody that couldn't buy or own a gun. And it seems to us that the standard in the Constitution is one of due process, is one of trials, and certainly if you're going to deprive somebody of a fundamental right protected by the Constitution, then it's incumbent that we go through those procedures. Otherwise, there's really not much to distinguish us from the Nazis or the Soviets.
There seems to be an all-out assault on gun rights. I recently read that they are seeking to take away rights from folks who might seek help for depression from a psychiatrist. They are being banned from gun ownership. Just because a person seeks help does not make them crazy.
Under Obamacare, that's precisely what can and is being done, and it means that you've got federal drones just pawing through all kinds of personal data from individual Americans who've been convicted of no crime. And that's the especially outrageous part of what we've allowed to happen. By the way, there was another distinction that might be well understood by your listeners, and that was in a fight a couple of years ago against the Disclose Act. I guess it was actually in 2010. The Congress, the House of Representatives, had voted in favor of a measure which greatly restricted campaign time speech. So the ability of Gun Owners of America to point out that Dianne Feinstein is a gun grabber and spell out the reasons, or Senator Schumer or a number of other politicians, that would have been blocked for a couple of months before a general election, and actually a month before a primary. And it was so patently an Incumbents Protection Act, it just reeked. But when the NRA got itself exempted from the measure, they turned from opposition to support. Well, happily, Rand Paul was in the Senate at that time, and he engineered a successful filibuster that killed the measure. But that was certainly a big difference between us and the NRA.
It's been my impression that the NRA has been compromising way too much and are part of the problem in many ways. The anti-gun crowd knows they can't ban all guns in one big effort. They take away rights incrementally. They get what they can and keep coming back for more. It seems important to me to never allow any encroachment on the Second Amendment.
They have been very steady about that, unlike our people who sometimes look at a defeat and say, "Oh well, what's the use? I guess I'll just go try something else." And that's not the way you advance an agenda. The other side seems to understand that very well. The Brady Law itself is the result of this tenacity on the part of the left. The bill was introduced 12 or 13 years before it finally passed. First year, no attention whatsoever. Second year, it was assigned to a subcommittee, no action. And so forth through the years. It gradually had more and more attention devoted to it by the Democrats, who at the time controlled the Congress, and by the media, and they used that for a long march through the Congress, through the public's attention, sold them a bill of goods, and there you are. So this is something that I think we could learn from the left, that they're not afraid of a tactical defeat. They don't look at every defeat as the end of the world, as a strategic blunder, but rather, as long as they've gotten the issue debated, they're willing to keep putting it forth. That's why, for instance, after the Newtown massacre, where the school children and teachers were murdered, Gun Owners of America went on the record and did a lot of television. In fact, a fairly infamous interview with Piers Morgan on CNN, it was included in that media work where we called for allowing teachers who are qualified for concealed carry to have a handgun with them concealed at school, or for that matter, any staff member, any adult who's qualified for concealed carry, so that you have the advantage of having people that are not visibly armed, so that some nut job comes in to try to do the next mass murder, which, by the way, have all but one in the last 20 years occurred in gun-free zones. I think maybe there's a lesson there. And then if something like that, God forbid, were to happen again, you don't know where an armed offender is going to come from, and it would make it much riskier for the assailant in terms of his grotesque target for, who knows, a bigger body count than the last one or whatever. It's just not going to be as happy a day for him. And in fact, that was the lesson in a Clackamas, Oregon mall 3 days before Newtown, about which we've had hardly any discussion. But it's a posted mall, no guns. Well, the murderer that killed two people and wounded a third obviously didn't give a rip about the posting. And happily, neither did a concealed carry fellow who saw he heard the gunshots. And happily, there was a jamming of the murderer's gun. And so while he was fiddling with that, the other guy with a gun, the good guy with a gun, comes running up to the sound of the shots. And just about that time, the murderer frees his gun, sees the good guy with the gun, and does what they almost always do when the good guy with the gun gets there. Boom, kills himself. End of problem. Happily, the guy was in violation of mall policy and probably guilty of something like a misdemeanor trespass or something of that sort. I have not been able to find that he's been prosecuted. I don't think you're going to get a jury to prosecute that gentleman.
I don't think so either. There are a lot of people who have more common sense than the government. You mentioned your interview with Piers Morgan. The YouTube video of that interview has gone viral on the social networks. That was a very heated exchange. I have to admit, I was a bit surprised by the hostility displayed by Morgan towards you. It's common knowledge that the media is anti-gun, but they are not usually that crude about it. In your experience with the media, is there a trend to be more aggressive?
No, I think Mr. Morgan was probably a little bit unusual in that regard. It's not unusual to have the reporter or the host of the show be on the other side. And whether I'm debating in Spanish or in English, it's the same thing except for the different words, the different languages. So it's a very common phenomenon. But what was unusual was, and I must say my own myth, I guess, of who the Brits are was shattered, because their accent, carry on, it just seems so proper and so staid. And I thought, this guy is behaving so differently from anything I ever imagined. And it looked to me, and I was thinking this during the interview, I really don't need to respond in kind, because why should I get between a man and his gun when he's committing suicide? It was evident that he was ruining his case. Later on, I was interviewed by Alan Colmes, a well-known liberal, as a radio program on the Fox network, and he said, look, I agree with Piers Morgan, but I was embarrassed by his behavior.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm glad that there is at least some journalistic standards left.
Yeah, and it's really it's a loser for him, because he is giving it away that he's clearly got an agenda. If they keep their voice modulated and they don't get excited and they ask their loaded questions, which sound generally fairly objective if you're not paying a lot of attention, they get a lot further along in promoting their agenda. But when he behaves in that fashion, afterwards I was thinking to myself, man, he sure made a good case for why we're no longer British.
Apparently not all Brits support Morgan. Jeremy Clarkson, host of the popular Top Gear show, tweeted, "Please don't send them back," and added, "Americans, was the Second Amendment not introduced to protect you from the tyranny of the British?" Piers Morgan, in other words?
I had heard about that, and also, as you know, there's a petition that's, I think, gone well over 100,000 to have Morgan deported. And then, in response, some Brits started one of these White House petitions, like the other one, saying, "No, we don't want him back." So it was just so evident during the debate that the guy was hurting himself, and while I could feel some anger welling up at one point because he was just so over the top, happily that did not prevail, and I was able to just let his train wreck happen without my having to jump in front of it and get squashed.
I believe you did exactly the right thing. He really looked foolish. You were the only adult in the room.
Well, so that was probably our best day, well, the best week, because within a very short period of time we had more new members join Gun Owners of America than have ever come in the same period of time. So it was to the point that I've kind of facetiously suggested that maybe I ought to start the Piers Morgan fan club.
You raise a very interesting point that often the anti-gun folks do more to increase gun ownership than reduce it with their illogical arguments and attacks on the Second Amendment. You mentioned Gun Owners of America's membership shot up, and I know that Texas is in a gun-buying frenzy right now. I read an article that a recent gun show in Fort Worth had a massive crowd. I would imagine it's not limited to Texas, but other states as well.
I don't know whether pigs fly, but apparently AR-15s do. They are uniformly described by reports as flying off the shelves. And at this point, they've all flown away from the stores, and they're not to be found anywhere. It's going to be quite some time before the industry is able to catch back up with the demand, which has just simply depleted their sales. One magazine seller said in 1 week he experienced 3 years worth of sales.
Wow.
So I'm not. I think a lot of fellows in the industry would probably join this tongue-in-cheek fan club for Piers Morgan.
With that being said, I still think there's a big danger that they still are making progress towards banning guns. It seems we are getting it from all fronts, not just the federal government, but the states as well.
I think, thanks in part perhaps to Piers Morgan, the initial reports are, I know in Missouri there's already a bill been introduced 3 weeks ago calling for the repeal of the gun-free school zones, and that's something that a state can do under the federal ban. They can specifically take their state out. They have to jump through a couple of hoops, which the feds unconstitutionally put in their way, but it can be done. And I think if anything happens, it's going to be a move against these gun-free school zones, because it's more and more people, I think, are getting it. This is not 20 years of the same thing happening, that it's not likely that gun-free school zones are going to become less lethal anytime in the future. Duh.
It truly defies logic. If you think about it, gun-free zone signs are really advertising that this building is full of unarmed potential victims. Why are these people who support gun-free zones surprised when in those very places that mass murders take place? I know there are a lot of people out there that want to defend the Second Amendment and retain their right for self-defense. What resources do you suggest for folks that want to join this battle to protect their rights?
Well, there's a couple of suggestions I would make. One is if they go to gunowners.org, which is our website, there's a fact sheet section, and I think even though we finished it some years ago, we've got it at the top of the chronological stack, and it's a 20-plus page paper that people have actually written term papers based on. It's just a pile of documentation of the various historical, constitutional, crime data type of arguments that you might encounter when you're dealing with the gun issue. So gunowners.org, go to the fact sheet section, and I think it'll be pretty evident which is the one that is the big mother lode. Otherwise, it's back in 2009 that we did our last revision, I think. But anyway, that's there, and I know people would get a lot of benefit from that. And the other thing, we've got an email alert that we would encourage people to join. It's free, and typically weekly during the meetings of Congress, we'll advise people about what's coming up. We'll embed an email in the alert so that they can fire it off to the appropriate member of Congress and kind of keep the heat on these members of Congress so that they know we're watching.
I thank you for sharing that information and giving our listeners your insight in the effort to defend the Second Amendment. It's good to know that Gun Owners of America is fighting that good fight.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it very much. One of your subscribers, and I very much appreciate what you all are doing.
The Pursuit of Freedom, the show for people ready to take back their republic.